Welcome to Wednesday, folks. Instructional designers in offices drinking coffee, brought to you by Domino, makers of Domino One. Check us out at www.dominknow.com. There's the radio voice for a Wednesday. Paul, how are you doing this morning?
Man, it is cold here.
Yeah,
It's below the zero if I'm in Celsius, but 6 in Fahrenheit. So we haven't quite hit the Fahrenheit zero, but it was chilly this morning.
righto. And that's the weather forecast from Denver. Here in Canada, it is also crisp. Here in Eastern Ontario in Canada, in the Ottawa area, and we're expecting a big pile of snow, 40 centimeters of snow tonight. So it's going to be a heck of a thing. Snowmageddon. We get a couple of these every year.
You can
and
keep
makes
it,
everybody
man.
excited. Yeah, no kidding.
We got a slight
Folks,
dusting.
Yeah, slight dusting. It's just a normal Tuesday, or a normal Wednesday night. Folks, we have a very special guest this week, Tim Handley. Tim, introduce yourself to our friends here today.
Yeah, hi, great to be here. My name's Tim. I'm now the Chief Product and Technology Officer for Wellbe, which is a UK-based company who helps schools and trusts improve wellbeing and take stakeholder feedback more generally. Before that, I was a head teacher and also instructional designer, so I've got kind of a myriad of different experience and backgrounds, but mainly focused around building great e-learning content for teachers and school staff using Domino and other tools as well. And particularly over the past year or so, how we can incorporate AI in a meaningful way into our content that doesn't detract from it, but actually helps aid the learning experience. So we have an LMS that's got 150 different resources, about 30 different e-learning courses in it, all of which now features some elements of AI in a managed way. Does that make sense? Because it's all self-serve, so it just helps with the learning experience.
Yeah, very cool. And I mean, you folks are very much focused on health and wellness related content from that perspective, as opposed to I don't know, something more like annual security training or those sorts of those sorts of more common or so your Wellbe has a kind of a niche in what kind of things you do provide. And I know you and I have chatted in the past several times about this project, because it's been paying attention to it for a year and a half, 2 years almost now, since you first told me about it. So what was it that you folks were, we were talking last week, Paul and I, among other things, about AI, and we were noting some of the common things that we're hearing, people looking to save time, money, etc., by using AI services to do tasks in a lot of cases. But you folks have got something different that you're using AI for. So maybe tell us a little bit what you're doing and how you went down this path.
Yeah, of course. I think AI has so many different uses, and obviously wouldn't it be in 2025 if you're on a podcast without talking about AI, I'm sure. And I think sometimes AI can be very buzzwordy though. I know we've talked about this before, Chris, and last week on the podcast as well, you guys talked about how it can be kind of this buzzword, and we wanted to make sure that we're incorporating AI in a way that made sense, but also wasn't just a buzzword. And obviously, when you look at instructional design, there's so many different areas we can use AI in terms of actually our job as instructional designers, in terms of helping prepare content, knowledge checks, and lots of things that we've talked about in the past. We wanted to really look to say, actually, how could we use it to help with the learning process, rather than just actually help us do our job. Does that make sense? So it's about actually what role could AI have within our courses? And we've worked on different kind of strategies we can show maybe slightly later of how we can incorporate AI to do things like branching scenarios, for example, but in a way that is far more realistic than a traditional kind of branching scenario where you have to kind of really define the routes and you can't necessarily predict what people are going to say or do. And we kind of work with things like that, as well as things like knowledge checks and things within a course, so that it works with kind of like that self-paced kind of learning kind of model, which obviously most of our instructional design courses are, which kind of really helps give that interactivity in a way that normal kind of quizzes and interactivity we could build in Domino or Articulate just can't. Does that make sense? But we were really keen to do that in a way that wasn't gimmicky as well, which I think can be careful. I think you talk to people about AI and either They talk about AI that isn't actually AI, which is interesting, or they talk about AI that's just been thrown in because somebody in the C-suite said, oh, we need some AI in our courses and we need some AI in our product, and everybody's going away previously looking at how AI make a difference, and maybe it's quite good without it anyway. So we don't use AI to replace things, just to add to the learning experience rather than detract from it or be there as a gimmick.
Yeah, that's something. And last week we had talked about challenges as well as opportunities, and AI was one of those big areas, and lots of great feedback and comment from folks that were watching too. And one of the things I haven't had a chance to fully see it as much as Chris has, but I did get a chance to see your sample, and I know we'll see some today. But it sounded to me like we had recommended that one of the things that you really did, and you said AI, not just for AI's sake or fake AI, just labeled AI, but could you maybe share a little bit with the audience some of your process and the team's process of what they went through in terms of going, hey, this AI could help improve our course, not just because it's a buzzword there, but this is an area where we're either having a challenge or we're not able to do it as much, or tell us a little bit about what kind of brought that up and how you kind of came up with that idea as opposed to just, hey, let's generate all our images through AI or something.
Yeah, definitely. I think the first thing to say is that it's not throwing out the instruction design best practices that we use for any other type of content. When we decide not to have a learning activity to give a learner or to put in a course or the content that we're developing, it's got to be there for purpose. It's got to be the best choice for what we're trying to achieve. And I think the same kind of goes for AI. It's another tool in our toolbox, or can be if we use it carefully, but it's not just something just to throw in because you need AI in a course, as we said. In terms of our journey getting to looking at how AI could play a part in courses and content itself, we first started by creating a AI chatbot trained on all of our learning content that sat outside the course. So within our LMS, we have Nebula AI, which is our kind of staff wellbeing coach stroke chatbot, and it's ingested all of our content from our courses, both coursework with Domino, our articles, videos, and any of our kind of expert wellbeing content, and uses that to help answer people's questions. So that's used tens, hundreds of times a day, depending on the day and the time of year and what's going on in the school calendar, both from the UK and the US, of a whole range of questions from, oh, my manager is being quite mean and putting too many unrealistic demands on me, to, oh, this happened, or just general kind of wellbeing advice. And that was received really well. That's been in the platform now for two and a half years. And when we created that, we wanted to make sure that it was based on our content rather than just going out to ChatGPT and saying, hey, answer this question and we'll pretend it's us, because if that's can be quite a common thing as kind of rappers and stuff. We then started looking and thinking, okay, great. So it's really going quite well in as a resource. How can we put that in our courses? Initially, as a bespoke kind of chatbot was in a course. So I'll show slightly later, but it was in all our courses. People can access kind of a chat help that's trained on just that course content. So we know that it's going to answer in line with the content in the course and any additional information our SMEs have given us, rather than just general answers. Does that make sense? So if we get an answer from our chatbot, we know it's going to align with the content they're going to meet in the course or have already met, so it's not potentially hallucinating and giving kind of some kind of difference of opinion or content, which I think is really key. So we did that first, worked out ways to do that in Domino, and then moved on from there, thinking, okay, great, where could it kind of work to help with things? So particularly, like say, in our coaching course, people really struggle sometimes with the difference between coaching and mentoring. So I can share that later, but we have a kind of a knowledge check where people can just write a free text response, and rather than having to go to an instructor to be marked, they get feedback on it within seconds, because AI is giving that feedback. Again, where we can have kind of branching scenarios that are not branching scenarios, because the AI will impersonate a teacher in a school and the person can coach them or can plan a different conversation. There's loads of these kind of different things that, by careful restrictions in the AI that we use and careful kind of technical prompting and different ways of making it work behind the scenes, we can actually add to the learning experience in a way that kind of makes sense and that learners kind of like, which is good. So we started off with one course, and then it's like, oh yeah, great, people using it, and we moved it into most of our courses now over time.
I was kind of curious, did you have a chat service before, or what kind of prompted the chat bot? Obviously, it's kind of a little bit of a knowledge on demand type thing there.
It is, yes.
What prompted that as a first choice? Was it filling a gap that you identified, or was it something that it was trouble keeping the staff up all hours of the day and night?
Yeah, so we didn't have a chat service before, but what we were experiencing was because of resale to schools and colleges and districts and estates and trusts in the UK, and all their staff get access to the learning resources, but the usage and logging of those learning resources can sometimes not be as great as maybe the school wants. We might do a survey and the staff report high levels of stress, but then actually going to access the resources is a different story. As with all kind of learning take up, particularly if they're not working in kind of mandatory training kind of scenario, everybody's on the LMS all the time. It's very much self-serve. When do I need it? And then the feedback we had from people, one of the reasons for that was because we had a whole breadth of content, branching wellbeing and kind of leading for wellbeing as well, was actually how do I find the right content for me to meet my needs in that moment? And that's kind of what the chatbot was developed initially to help people do, both to signpost the content, which it can do fairly well, but also to give those answers kind of in that kind of moment and act more as a coach. So we train that chatbot to coach people rather than give the answers, because it's not kind of a just Q&A chat, but it kind of helps that thinking kind of process. Because throughout our courses and content, we very much are kind of a coaching methodology, encouraging leaders who are using our resources to coach their staff. So it's kind of important for us that what we offered as a service kind of did that too. So that's kind of what started that initial kind of look, was actually how do we increase use of it, which has kind of worked really well, and we've developed that in Raise as well. So now it will recommend a series of courses or series of contents, a mixture of videos, articles and courses from our kind of catalogue. So rather than just saying, oh great, why don't you do this, or say, why don't you do this journey of X, Y and Z, which kind of helps people take that learning to the next kind of step onwards. Does that make sense?
Oh, cool. You've talked a little bit about what you are doing. I wonder, maybe this is a good time to maybe show it to folks and get them
I will do, obviously.
picture.
Yeah. Guys are listening on the podcast afterwards, come find it on LinkedIn and they can see about. But we'll do our
Yeah,
best
for
to
sure.
describe.
If you're catching up on this in an audio only format later on, you might want to just check out the LinkedIn video to see the things that the rest of us are seeing here today.
Yeah, and just to say, these are kind of demo course slides that are taken from different courses throughout our kind of catalogue. It's not a coherent instructional design kind of approach. It's just examples of how things are working. But at the top of each course, we have got our kind of chatbot, which kind of pops up. So here's from our coaching course, for example, and people can ask kind of like, okay, well, I'm confused about the difference between coaching and mentoring. Can you help? And what we find is people kind of use that throughout the course, so that if they're looking at some content and maybe aren't too sure about it from the traditional content we've provided, they'll go and ask some questions to Nebula within kind of a chatbot. This is kind of a parameterized version of our rider kind of chatbots, but it sits within the course and, as we say, knows that course's content. So it's going to answer kind of in line with that. We then kind of use it for knowledge check. So, for example, in our coaching course, sticking to the same theme, there is the kind of what is the difference between coaching and mentoring. And if I give a very basic answer, we'll see that the AI will kind of go and it will look at the answer, point out what the strengths are in there. And then we'll also point out kind of some of the areas where it could be improved. This sits at the kind of very start of our kind of coaching course, and it helps people kind of direct themselves through kind of the processes as well throughout the course. And again, this is anything that says as feedback isn't going to be contradicted by content and then meet later on in the course, because it knows that kind of has that kind of content there. We also offer it kind of as knowledge check. So if they have done, say, this knowledge check and they haven't scored, they require kind of pass mark or kind of mark, not pass mark as a knowledge check, but the kind of mark that we would suggest shows then they can move on, rather than just saying, oh, do you want to be watched, or do you want to kind of have the different kind of content? We say, okay, do you want to ask Nebula instead? And we find that it's quite a common choice. That's another way for people to learn to kind of recap. And then this is where our users really like it, is where we have kind of like this. So again, in our coaching course, we used to have a kind of print out coach yourself style coaching activity, as well as a branching scenario built using the kind of the branching scenario build in Domino. But we were finding that was very difficult for people to actually coach themselves, but also with the branching scenario to actually get a branching scenario that's realistic to what an actual coaching conversation would be like. So this kind of is configured to get people to choose kind of one of three scenarios that we've kind of prompted the AI about. So say I've chosen behavior here, and then the AI will then go from being kind of that instructor into the role of a teacher in this situation, and will give kind of the user kind of their prompt, and the user can ask coaching questions back and kind of go through the grow model, the coaching process, and it kind of sustain it. So we could finish off by saying, okay, any resources you could use to help. So going kind of like to the opportunities part of grow, and it will respond again as in time as a teacher. And then once I've finished and I think, great, I've done really well at coaching this person, I can say done. And the AI will switch back into kind of instructor mode and will review the conversation and give feedback about how that conversation could have been better. So it kind of talks out against the grow model that we've been teaching in the course, says, okay, this is how we did it, and then kind of gives kind of the next steps kind of from there. So rather than just a scenario that sits as quite static and then we have to kind of dream up all the different routes through it, this can be quite it can respond to what the user says kind of in that moment. Cool.
I was just going to say, and so in this model, the AI is not only providing the other half of the conversation and reacting to the learner's posting, but then at the end, it's also then providing a summary and I mean, not a score here per se, but a feedback with positives and places to improve.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, and if you do, I had quite a bit of fun of it being a really awful coach, and it will kind of pick it out in a really nice way, but say, hey, you could have done this differently, or this and here and here. Obviously, here it's barely okay coaching conversation, so it's basically acknowledged that and given some areas of improvement as well, which kind of gives that kind of feedback. And I think it was important that you get both sides of it. Does that make sense? That we can use AI to be that kind of like to take the role and role play effectively. We can do this in lots of our course in different ways as well. But then it can switch to giving that feedback. So again, it knows the content in the course, it knows what we define as best practices and what we said for our context as best practices, and can then analyze the conversation that's happened before against those kind of best practices and help give that kind of feedback and next steps in there.
Yeah, one of the things that I noticed right away when I looked at it, and of course it's being reinforced right here as you're sharing it, is honestly how integrated it is into the flow. It doesn't feel like you're doing something different. I mean, as folks who use Domino know, you can integrate other tools right into it there if there's a particular feature you want there. But from the look and feel, also I noticed kind of the flow of the instructional design at the beginning. I kind of, hey, describe coaching, and it limits it to 150 words, because at that point you're just like, hey, what's your initial ideas, and getting feedback, and then you're getting into the flow of this. But maybe you could tell us a little bit about some of the types of things. And I find people to think that, it just needs to be this generic black and white when they're using it, but obviously not, even with some of these colors and stuff.
Yeah, exactly. And I think it is just about, obviously, giving the right type of AI at the right point of the course. Does that make sense? Obviously, we've shown 4 different types of AI in quick succession here. A learner would never meet that in our course. They never meet AI followed by AI followed by AI. We try to limit it to 3 to 4 in a course, and our courses tend to be at 2 hours of learning content at the most. And most of our courses don't even hit that, because we don't want it to be, I'm doing some more AI. It's another bit of AI. It's this. That it's about in moderation. I think when we oversaturate things of any type of learning activity, it can kind of have that kind of impact, and also integrating it with things we've got already. So, for example, in our emotional intelligence course, we built a self-assessment, which is kind of built using additional kind of variables, a different domino, which kind of assesses their emotional intelligence. It will give their feedback, which again is normal kind of like kind of domino features, but then it will have a chatbot that says, okay, do your results kind of match what you think, and kind of help people take it beyond that kind of traditional self-assessment kind of activity to actually, okay, what do we think? So I could say, I thought I was better at managing my emotions, but my self-awareness had, I thought, and then the AI will come back and help almost coach that person through those results. So rather than just being what used to be there, which is ended here, and a reflection activity, actually guiding somebody through that reflection activity when the AI decides to answer. As you can see, and it will go and ask questions, and you can have quite a nice conversation with it, again, based on those kind of results that person has got. So it's not just sitting, great, here's my self-assessment, I'm going to go do the rest of the course now. Or particularly when you think about things like emotional intelligence, and what we're finding with users is we assess their emotional intelligence, and if it didn't match what they felt it was, that can cause upset, for want of a better word, and kind of that kind of reduce somebody's well-being rather than improve it. So actually having this opportunity to address that in the moment and be, okay, great, did it reflect what you thought? If not, why not kind of thing, and then help in giving those kind of suggestions, and kind of not so doing it in this response, but often it will say, oh yeah, at this point in the course we'll be looking at these areas in more detail, so it will kind of signpost to where in the course they'll actually look at these things rather than just saying, oh great, yeah, fantastic, or say, okay, into this section we'll look at this, so they know where to maybe focus more on when they get through the learning content.
Mm-hmm.
That kind of made me think of one of the things, and you mentioned this before, is that you trained it on the content, and of course, folks are, at least rightly should be, worried about hallucinations, as you mentioned, having something wrong. And I was just thinking of that last comment of, yeah, if the feedback about my disagreeing with the scoring on my emotional intelligence wasn't presented in a thoughtful and well way, it may have a very negative impact. And from a practical standpoint, maybe you could talk a little bit about how you trained the AI and those particular pieces on that content, how you fed it in there. I think some of the nuts and bolts folks are knowing that they need to do, but haven't experienced yet, other than maybe typing into chat
GPT,
AI.
yeah, indeed. I think it's, when we talk about AI, there's so many different buzzwords out there and training models and a whole range of different things. I think increasingly the standpoint is actually you don't need to go and train your own model, but you can sufficiently restrict and give access to your resources to models or version models that are already out there. So most of these items actually run on Gemini 1.5, so they run on a Google model, but they're heavily restricted. So you can change things called like temperature, for example, in AI, which basically means how crazy from what you've given it is it going to go. So if you set a temperature of 0.1, it's going to stick very rigidly and be quite predictive, deterministic. If you set it to 1, it's going to go a bit more crazy. But we kind of manage that training by saying, okay, here's a bank of resources to use using a technique called retrieval augmented generation, which has kind of been a buzzword for a while now. It actually takes the content, puts it into numbers, a numerical version, and finds the most relevant bit of content for the user's question by some lovely maths that is too complicated to even get my head around. But it works, and it finds it and retrieves it, and it basically gets given that content alongside our prompts, and our prompts are quite well engineered to be really restrictive where it needs to be, or more open where it doesn't need to be. So because obviously it sits within Domino, these are all kind of embedded as iframes, so the bits you're seeing exist on a page in a LMS somewhere that's hidden from normal use, just so we can access it through there as a kind of practical way of getting it into your e-learning content. But the actual AI bits is all done through kind of retrieval augmented generation or careful prompting. We did back in 2022 an experiment with training a model, but if you're going to train your own model, you have to probably at least 100,000 question and answers and points of content, and then it's still very restricted. And actually using a base model is probably the way to go for most kind of LMD scenarios. Making sure you use a model there that's not going to use it for training. So all of our AI is done in a secure way. That means that it sits with just our content in our own perimeter. So it's our own versions of the models sitting in Google Cloud data centers, most of them. They're not ever used for training or to improve an AI, so there's no risk of kind of thinking more traditional instructional design content, your kind of industrial secrets, so to speak, or ways of working appearing. So even somebody asks ChatGPT in 2 years' time how to do something, it's very much tied within the perimeter and secured. Does that make sense in that way?
Yeah. So you've got your own. Each of those different cases are also separate AI instances, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
So they're focused.
So yeah, they exist as, so for most of them, not this demo, most of them exist in a hidden page in LMS. So we make sure the user logged into them, so you can't go and find them kind of publicly and have fun. So they kind of exist in a hidden page, and that's where they're kind of embedded from into the content. But each of them is their own instance, each with their own prompt and own kind of background and knowledge and data store that it's going to go and use. So for example, the chatbox at the top of the page effectively have all the course content and more. So if you've got any additional information that we haven't put into the course that might be useful, we kind of give it that as well. Whereas the kind of like the coaching one I showed has got very basic information in its prompt. It's got a very long prompt. The prompt basically gives it how it should respond, kind of what role play it's playing, and how it should mark in inverted commas at the end and feedback on. And actually with no content beyond that, just the prompt, but it's told to not deviate from it. and has a very low temperature, so we know it's going to be quite consistent in how it responds.
Yeah. And just for folks who are listening, the prompt is what you're telling
Oh yes, sorry. Yeah.
the AI to do, right?
Yes, yes.
It's
So,
how
so,
you're,
so,
in a
yeah,
sense, kind of programming it, but you use this
yeah,
prompting kind of structure of telling it what to do.
yeah. So the prompt wraps around what we use of inputs. So and it works for all AIs. There's a prompt or prompts hidden behind ChatGPT, for example, that go beyond to the AI itself to tell the AI how to respond to your input. Does that make sense? So what to kind of manage and do. So some of those prompts, they are very, very tight and reflect kind of what we do with their prompt designing. Is a whole new skill that people are learning, but it is literally just writing clear instructions. I always say to the writing prompts to kind of think the AI is kind of like a toddler almost, and you need to be quite clear with it and unambiguous, and it tends to kind of work. Also, Gemini public models are quite good at improving prompts. So if you go to like Gemini on the website and say, I've got this prompt for whatever AI model, it will try and help you improve the prompt, because Google's kind of done a lot of work on that to help kind of AIs improve their own prompt, which is yeah, an interesting way to do it. So you can kind of get these prompts to really tight there.
And I was thinking, especially for folks who may not be in deep into AI and they're just hearing about it and thinking about it, maybe you could kind of explain a little bit. So when you're talking about models, are you talking about, hey, ChatGPT's primarily, or Gemini? And then, of course, within that, once you pick that, you're basically, and sometimes I've heard it referred to as questions. You can kind of store individual questions, and that question has this information. Did you feed in links or files? Or
yeah,
both, so a little bit about that.
Yes, yeah. So the base AI models are what different providers provide. So OpenAI have a model guard, and they call it, I think, they have 13 or 14 publicly available models, all of which are have different costs to use, but also have different strengths and weaknesses and response times as well. Gemini has 5 or 6, and then you've got Claude, who have their anthropic models. You know, have DeepSeek out there if you fancy taking a risk, and lots of different providers who provide these kind of base models, which you can then prompt, and through that kind of writing those prompts, you kind of construct it to what to do. When you're giving it information, you tend to do that through retrieval augmented generation. So effectively, it takes the user's question, it behind the scenes, it does 2 AI calls. You can do it without use any code, so anybody can make it work. It does 1 AI call to kind of work out which bit of information is most relevant to the user's query, or which bits of information. It then takes that information and puts it back to the main AI and says, here's the user's query, here's the instructions we're given at the prompt, here's the information that we found that might be useful. Go have fun and make that as your answer, kind of thing, and it'll take that information and use it, and kind of thing. So it kind of does 2 calls in the background, but you don't really have to know it's doing that. That's just technically kind of how it's working, which means you can then really restrict it to information that you know is good quality, so yeah, so in our case, it's pretty much all of the content we have and more in LMS, but then we restrict that even further in the courses. So you can ask a question in the coaching course, it's not going to suddenly go and start talking to you about about emotional intelligence, for example, necessarily, unless it fits the coaching context, or about our other courses we've got on there. It's going to be kind of domain specific, where possible, in those things there.
Yeah, and there's a question that I think ties into this too, and I'll kind of repeat that, but it sounds like, so for each of the different use cases, you've said, hey, and of course you have a paid account that enables said, hey, you can't train, it's not being used to train anything else on the model, but these are the 2 documents or the 50 documents or pieces of information you can use. You're going to react this way based on the prompt and stuff. You're a nice you're a nice therapist, whatever the case is, that you're kind of coach in there, or you're a you're a coach who really wants to push them hard and stuff. And kind of one of the things, and this was a question from Roberto out there, I think is a great question. From your experience developing content and courses with AI, how do you address the potential biases that might have crept into the models? Because we've seen that in the news too, just the models themselves, of course, based on what they train, biases creep in. So
they do. And I think that comes down to the decisions about when you use AI. So there's some content that we would never put AI through because we don't want it to expose any of those hidden biases that we've got particularly when it comes to data. So we do a lot of work with data. We're talking about maybe later data and AI, both generally, but also in the e-learning context. And we are very careful of the type of data that we'll get AI to work on, because we don't want those unconscious biases that the AI has, or conscious biases potentially that the AI has, to kind of creep in. I think when you have a really restricted prompt, some instructions to the AI, and really carefully chosen model and background information that you get it to kind of ground itself in, the chance for those biases to come through are very, very limited, or if not pretty much non-existent, because of it's going to be very closely following the information that you have given it and the information to base those answers on. So you're effectively saying, yeah, we know you've got all this big knowledge of all your big training on the whole internet and whatever else it's kind of hoovered up as part of its training, but forget most of that and just use this, and then only go to that if you really need to, and in these parameters kind of thing. So it kind of that allows you to do that without then having those kind of being exposed too much to those biases. But again, it's that choice, but also careful kind of play testing almost of the AI. So if you look at our kind of AI logs, you'll see me and some other developers having lots of fun in inverted commas trying to provoke the AI to respond in a way that we don't want it to respond, to make sure actually that we can't provoke it to do it. We also, given our wellbeing context, have tested and made sure that if somebody expresses self-harm or suicidal ideation and things like that in the chatbot, that it will respond appropriately, because obviously that was really key for us to make sure that we're not in any way giving the wrong information out there. I think for the wellbeing context, most of the models are quite well grounded in being safe when it comes to wellbeing, which is good. Gemini models tend to be more so than OpenAI, hence why we can prioritize those as well. For that content, but yeah, in terms of unconscious bias, it is about being really careful about how you use it, where you use it, but also having that grounding in your content, which you know won't be biased, hopefully, will kind of help mitigate the risk for the models to be biased. I know that we have some context, for example, Google, we work with quite closely. I know that Gemini, for example, it worked on continuously to eliminate bias, and there is bias kind of testing that both OpenAI, Google, and Anthropic do for Claude as well. So I think it is an issue that we will be getting better over time as well, hopefully.
Yeah, so it sounds like there's really a couple tiers to that controlling it. One is recognizing that there is potentially some bias in the model itself. Yeah. And just like you might QA your course, I'm hoping everyone out there is doing that, taking advantage of the review features and things like that, and QAing that to make sure it's there. But even a bigger component is, of course, when you're just going out to ChatGPT or Gemini and typing in stuff, it's using the whole internet, which has all its own biases and other things in there that may not be as obvious. But you're saying here, I'm controlling the content very in there. And of course, hopefully we've put in well thought content that eliminates that bias too. So no, that's great.
Yeah. It minimizes the opportunity for that bias to surface, I think, is the best way to put it. And again, it is that testing and QAing that's really important to make sure that we can't get it to give a biased response. That makes sense. Which in Germany, we haven't really found it to be an issue. We have designed against it. Does that make sense? Which is probably why we haven't found it to be an issue, because we made sure that we're doing things in a way that is controlled. And if it kind of managed, and in fact, we play tested the main chatbot that we've got, which works with the wellbeing coach, and trying to provoke it to give really biased responses.
I was kind of curious
and trying to be kind of the worst version of the person you think who could be interacting with AI could be, which is interesting to do. But actually, no, it just won't, because it's so well grounded in the content that isn't biased, and it will use that as its primary response tool. The reason why, because you can restrict AI completely to only use your content, or largely, by turning the temperature down and being really strict. For our main chatbot, we do let it go to wider training if needed, because of, whilst we've got a lot of content, when it comes to the world of wellbeing, sometimes we might not actually have the knowledge we have. But again, that is really restricted in terms of the kind of sources. It will also search the web to get more up-to-date information, but again, in a very parameterized way. So we don't let it go to anybody on the internet. We say, oh, look at these 7 or 8 different sources if you need additional help. But in the courses, we don't have any of that. It is literally just using the content of that course, because what we didn't want it to do is to say something that contradicts what the course is trying to say. Does that make sense? And I think,
yeah. I was kind of curious if you had, and I was thinking, hey, your chatbots are using a lot more information, and thanks for sharing that. It also has some external information on there. Were there any as you were testing that or approving in there, were there any aha moments of, oh, we should have really added this to a prompt or that, or either hallucinations or things just not presented in the right way that you wanted them to be?
Yeah, I think it is, as I said, just being incredibly clear to the AI how you want it to behave, to give it a really clear persona of what it is acting as. So acting as a coach, acting as an instructor, acting as whatever, and what its really clear role is. And telling it not to deviate from the role. So ironically saying, do not deviate from this has a material impact on how the AI responds, which is bizarre. But they say, if you talk to a toddler, saying, oh, don't do anything about this kind of thing, it kind of really works. There's lots of interesting prompt techniques out there about kind of telling the AI it's playing a game, and if it doesn't do this, it will lose or whatever, which has different, we don't use that, but there's lots of different kind of ways to kind of convince the AI to kind of behave, but generally it is about that clarity of the prompt, but also not worrying about the length of the prompt. So there's been some research about prompt length, and as long as you don't go crazy and give it like thousands and thousands of characters, the more detail it has in a prompt, the better for it to then be more consistent about what you want.
Right.
And I think it is those temperature features, so that's why it's important to use a version of a way that you make an API call effectively through many different tools, and you can do it in a no-code way. So you can control the temperature, particularly, is a key one. If you're finding it not behaving quite like you want and not adhering to the prompt, then you dial that temperature down to a point where it has kind of that the good kind of balance.
How you've mentioned, that you guys did a lot of testing. I mean, for one instance of using this, like, what's the ballpark time that you guys spent making sure that this was going to do what you wanted to do in that particular context?
So I think initially it was much longer. So days of work to kind of make sure it does what you want. Now we have kind of the prompting techniques kind of down and sorted, so to speak. Obviously we do play test them to make sure it's not going to go crazy, but there's less QA doing, because actually it's based what it's using. If it's base knowledge store or the base prompt is very similar, with slight tweaks. For example, so we have a number of the examples where it's that coaching example where we're saying, what is coaching and how does it differ from mentoring. We have a number of those throughout our courses, and it's a few changes to the prompt, if that makes sense, because we have a kind of a catalog of what works. The same for those scenarios. Well, it's the base knowledge it's going in the vector store, so where we load the data to is different. Actually, its prompt is very similar with just some changes to it. So it's a bit like if you're doing any kind of version control and any kind of traditional kind of development kind of approach, is actually having a base, working from it and iterating from it rather than keep reinventing the wheel each time.
Yeah,
I was thinking about what you were just saying there, and then there was a comment from Patricia talking about her chat GTP. She calls Dara as funny. I was talking to another person and they call it Chatty. They even think about naming it, but it becomes a personality there. And she said that it always asks the intent of the conversation, because it's she shared at various times what she's doing, and then it just shifts quite happily, as she noted. I was thinking, are there some tips or things that you can provide to the audience of, hey, when you're starting to write some prompts, here's our 3 key things. There's a lot of things you can do, but these are the things that made the most impact for us when we were starting to develop and get the AI to respond in the way we wanted to and not go off track.
Yeah, definitely. I think it's breaking it down into kind of 3 key sections. One is there's the persona or the role it's taking. So starting with your role is A and you are A, and giving the kind of context. And normally in our context, you are a wellbeing coach who is working on this course with learners who are teachers or school staff from the UK. So we give it quite a bit of context. We have different prompts for UK and US as well, because we have different versions of course of UK and US too. So we have a slightly different prompt because of how it will respond will be different. Also UK, US English. So we don't have US folks saying, "Oh, where's the Zs?" and UK folks saying, "Why are there lots of Zs in your words?" so we kind of have different prompts for that. Then we go into kind of the next kind of main context kind of bit about the course and the content where it is. And then we split it down into your response kind of section where we say, okay, when you respond, you're responding like this, or you're going to respond in this way. So it kind of has that kind of structure between, okay, persona, kind of base prompt information, and then how do you want me to respond? And then for sometimes we put in a section that's just kind of rules. So we say, okay, do not do this, or do this. And sometimes that kind of section works as well, depending on the content that you've got, but giving it a set of rules to follow at the end of your prompt. sometimes really works as well. If you say, do not do this, always do this, always give this information. So for example, we say for kind of the well-being stuff for the user, potentially concerns, always make sure you give a relevant helpline that he can go to and things like that. So we kind of had those kind of rules in there. And that kind of works really well. I know obviously our wellbeing content is specific and it's different than the traditional kind of e-learning stuff, but we have played, I've worked with a couple of other companies and worked on this in a more traditional e-learning sense, and that works really well too. Does that make sense? It's not just well-being. It works really well with your fire safety trainings and all those kind of stuff that we need, and manual handling, all those kind of traditional, lovely e-learning stuff that we have to do each year. It can work really well in that context too. It's not just this well-being context. Obviously, it has its own quirks, being well-being, but it can work equally well, if not better, in those more traditional contexts too.
Yeah. Roberto had another question in the chat that we'll check with, and then I think something I'd love to learn more after that would be the reaction, from your learning audience and how, what's the reception on that. But Roberto's sort of following up on biases and guardrails. When accessing educational data, for example, are the models being trained on anonymized data sets, or access to the full data set is needed to identify patterns?
So it's a bit outside the e-learning context, but our data models that work for education data is completely anonymized. So it doesn't ever have access to underlying data. We also have the same for some of XAPI statements. We're trialing an AI that will help taking XAPI statements and kind of a number kind of action kind of stuff that it's doing in this, because the format of those statements actually is quite nice for AI to kind of work. It's consistent, and the XAPI statements come in a consistent way. And feeding XAPI statements to an AI to help identify learners' next steps, and for kind of supervisors, not supervisors, head teachers and principals in schools, about to ask more questions about the learning activity of individual people or more aggregate. But again, in a way, it doesn't actually know that Bob said this, or when it comes to education data, we don't know that Harry has got special educational needs and he's autistic and he's this. We know that that's his characteristics, but the AI never had access to that. It can only query that in a way that doesn't have access to that. It's semi-complex, but yeah, obviously slightly out of context. But yeah, for education data, we are very, very careful about how it does that. And again, biases come there. So when we look at our provided stuff we do with schools and colleges about data, we will never let AI analyze any ethnicity data, for example, because again, with those biases, it's not quite there yet for it to be able to start to make judgments on ethnicity that are safe necessarily. Not that we've had any awful experiences, but again, it's just safeguarding. But yeah, it's about always having, when it comes to data, having anonymized, well, never have access to the raw data, but be able to operate on the data without actually seeing it. Does that make sense? So there's different ways that you can do that. That go beyond this kind of traditional e-learning content, which is far more simple in kind of the AI approaches. But yeah, to say yes, so in terms of data, there's that. But when it comes to the learning content, it is literally about being really careful with the guardrails in your prompting and grounding it in your data. So never really letting it go solely on the main model. Because also the main model changes, so there'll be different iterations. OpenAI are releasing different iterations of their models all the time. So different levels of training data in it, and yeah, and things like that. I think the other thing, just before we get on to kind of the responses, it's important not to play test it by using ChatGPT, for example, because you need to be using the type of prompting that you're going to be doing and the model you're going to be using, because ChatGPT, for example, will search the web. But often now, if you use more recent models, if you use a base OpenAI model via API, it won't search the web. So actually the quality of response will be different than you would get using the public GPT, because all that is doing is putting lots of prompts around what you're saying to it, and in a quite clever way. So it's important to test it with the actual version of the API you're using. So whilst you can have a bit of an idea of using a public service, actually using something like, so OpenAI have a developer studio and a playground, they call it. Google have the same with Google AI Studio. You can play more with the prompts and system instructions and temperatures and stuff there before you then go and say, oh great, use this tool to build it with. That makes sense.
Cool. Yeah. So yeah, let's talk about the end results here. Do you know what kind of feedback have you had from people who experienced this in the course content, and what kind of things have you been noticing in patterns, that kind of stuff?
Yeah, so we think that we noticed with data that the completion rate of courses has increased when AI has been included. I think because people feel like they are more engaged and it's less of a passive experience. So they're obviously already and trying not to be passive, but ultimately there is a degree of passivity even just watching a video. So they feel more engaged with it. When we look at feedback, particularly from the main chatbot, that is overwhelmingly positive. Have a feedback form underneath it to give feedback, because in case it does anything that people don't like or whatever, and we haven't had anybody say, "Oh, it's done this," or "It's told me to do this," and I don't agree with it. The feedback has been overwhelmingly positive from end users, and the time spent in our NMS and in our resources has increased as a result of actually put AI and other developments in there. Which I think is kind of testament. It's obviously always really difficult to isolate, or because you put AI in that it did this, but actually through different product iterations that we've got in the end product to our users, kind of that usage has increased, which is really good. And I think we wouldn't design a course without AI in it somewhere now, unless it really didn't benefit. Does that make sense? I think there's always is a key thing in a learning toolbox now to kind of put into courses to help. I think obviously we said before, it can be really good in the helping you do your job kind of process as well, and video stuff. I'm sure lots of people use things like Synthesia or Epic or Veed and stuff to do the videos. You don't have to wait for somebody to record stuff now, and there's all these kind of benefits, and we use those too. But yeah, I say it is that for us, the real power comes from it being in the learning.
And one thing, I don't know that we've we certainly haven't focused on it, but I mean, you guys are being upfront with your learner that this is an AI experience as part of the approach that you're taking.
Always. So we name the AIs. The AI is named Nebula AI just because naming an AI is more difficult than you think, because I think actually what embodies an AI in the best way. It took an ages to come to name and still not too happy. And so we always say that Nebula AI will do this, or if you click on the icon, it's Nebula AI. So we're always really clear that it is an AI interaction, and also clear when it's not AI. So like the self-assessment you saw before, you got the AI bit of emotional intelligence stuff. It's lots of sliders and variables. We're very clear that this is a self-assessment. We don't say it's AI because it's not. It's just variable based and generates the results to the extent it has the conditions on it. So it's about being really clear, I think, with learners about when AI is being used. When it's not used, even our videos are AI generated. We're clear that they are AI avatars. You can, even with the best ones now, you can still tend to tell, but even with the ones that are more realistic, you can just like get away with it. We are very clear that AI tutor will help with this, or watch the video from AI. So we don't think that so we're being completely open up front with people.
There was one other question I just saw in there. I don't know if you can comment on it, but like your thoughts. And Sunat had asked any experience comments you can share on technical training, like an engineering field. And I was thinking, if I had to guess there, some of it is that a lot of it, same principles would apply as long as you're having it focus on that particular training, that material, restricting it there, you can get some of that information back. I know that AI has become very popular to help out programming and programming assistance. As well as
I think in the technical side, there's a whole range of different gambits you can go down. You can use like no code options. So both OpenAI have one, the public. Google have a Google AI Lab, I think it's called, or Agent Builder. Microsoft have one that is part of Power Apps, which can get quite expensive, but if you've got the right Microsoft subscription, it can work quite well for you if that's kind of how you authenticate using the NMS. You also have things like Bubble and Retool, which are kind of no-code app builders. So as instructor designers without coding knowledge, you can go in, and as long as you get an API key from your provider, it will help you do the front end bits. And I've seen people do what we've done, but with lots of different Bubble apps, so to speak, built, because they give you a website and it can be hidden and things. So the ways to do that without having to get kind of in with the code. If you're doing more kind of data stuff, like we're doing with some next API stuff and more wider education data, then obviously, yes, you need some kind of coding knowledge or somebody who can help you with that coding knowledge. But I would say as instructional designers, we have kind of that skill to be able to break down what we want the end outcome to be and how we might get there, which then helps the developer do it easier. And the AI APIs and AI kind of like technical bits in the back end are not as complicated as it used to be. They're often written in Python, but apart from that, they're kind of all okay. and even AI itself is quite good at helping you code an AI app if you really wanted it to. So you can get there's a service called V0, which is like version 0.dev, that will literally code an app for you and help you deploy it with just you prompting it, and it works 90% of the time quite well. And so you can build these things even with AI if you really wanted to. But again, play test it, make sure it's QA'd.
Yeah, there was a show I was at it, and one of the speakers did it on the fly. We all know how things on the fly go, and was able to create a pretty decent checkers game, but failed on the Tetris game and used one of those low code apps there. But yeah, it's pretty impressive.
Yeah, and I think it is that, and I think in our field we're very good at teaching ourselves new technologies as well. And I think it's not beyond the bounds anybody who works in structural design field to be able to do this themselves too. I can code now in AI apps without using no code stuff, and I wasn't a developer 3 or 4 years ago. so yeah, I can. Yeah, there's lots of things. It's not as complex as it looks when you get down. Just like learning a new tool is. You think some e-learning tools, obviously not Domino, but other e-learning tests can be quite complex to get used to, and we can all manage those too. So,
Tim, thanks so much for coming and joining us here this week and sharing. We really appreciate it. It's been really cool to watch you guys over the past couple of years with the project and how you have evolved it over time. I know when we first talked about it was one thing, and you started adding other options, and really cool as well to hear that the way that your learners have reacted to it. I mean, your data, even just with completion increasing, is a good demonstration of its potential value.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and I love how you have come in. You identified one area that you had a gap for, added that in, and then kind of grew it on it, and very thoughtfully as you add in. And I like, as you said there, hey, we aren't throwing in just for AI's sake there. And we also, just like anything else, there can be too many tabs in a course. There's too much of any one thing in there. So I really love how you've done that with the team there, and very thoughtful in just your responses. Obviously, you have a lot of responsibility with the type of training that you're putting out there. And, some people can be in quite distress using theirs. So thank you so much for sharing that today.
Yeah. Gang, we will dance on out of here. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Great conversations in the chats too. Really appreciate your time, your interest. Don't forget, Idiotic Instructional Designers in Offices Drinking Coffee is brought to you by the team here at Domino. Paul and I are both members of the team. And if you have any interest in that, don't forget to check us out on that front. Hey, let's dance on out of here.